Always fun watching the participant number go up and up and up. All right, I'm going to make a start. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our third session today of the Healing the Hurt Forum. My name's Claire Ryan, and I'm the team leader of the clinical practice development in Take Two, and I'm going to moderate this session today and the next two sessions. Thank you for joining us at this forum. I'm aware that some of you will have already participated in the two previous sessions that we had this morning, and some may have just joined for the first time now for this session. So to those people who have just joined, welcome, and to those people who are rejoining, I'm sorry you have to listen to this every time. We're really hoping that this forum gives all of the people in the audience a chance to hear a little bit about Take Two's perspective on working in a trauma-informed way, specifically with infants, children and young people and their families who have experienced most often abuse, neglect, but also other types of trauma as well. And we're hoping that you, from each session, that you have some sort of practical takeaway tips that you can think about putting into your practice, no matter what your role is with kids and young people. This session's being recorded, so please just be aware of that. And the purpose of the recording is so that we can make this available to people after these sessions, and also particularly for people who weren't able to join us today, so that they can also have access to this information. We're not providing the PowerPoint slides from each of the presentations, apart from the first session this morning, which was the session delivered by Morel Lynch and Sandra Radavini. We will make the PowerPoints available from that particular session. We are talking about clinical case examples in the session, so just be aware that all of the clinical case examples that we do refer to have been thoroughly de-identified, and any images that you see on the slides are just stock images. They're not images of the actual clients themselves. Allison, if you could just move to the next slide, please. I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're all meeting on today. I'm here on Boonwurrung country down in southeast Melbourne, but I'd like to acknowledge all traditional owners on all the lands that we're meeting on across Australia today, and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also really like to acknowledge the strength and resilience of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and it always has been and it always will be Aboriginal land. So I would like to introduce our next two speakers. We have Dr. Lynn Radford and Dr. Allison Cox. So Lynn is the clinical manager of Take Two South East and Gippsland Division. She's a clinical psychologist, and Allison Cox is the Take Two director, and Allison's an occupational therapist and a psychotherapist. So they're going to do an overview, particularly focusing on assessment in Take Two. What I would encourage you all to do is to open up the chat thread if you haven't already, and please feel free to use that chat thread to make comments, ask questions, etc. My colleagues Jessamy House and Jen Willis and Kat Wood will be keeping an eye on that, so they may respond to some of your questions in the chat thread. I'll also be keeping an eye on that, and depending on the time, we may have the chance for me to put some of those questions or comments to Lynn and Allison during the session. Just trying to think about other housekeeping. Oh, and look, just a final reminder that because we are talking about abuse and neglect and the bad things that happen to kids and to families, just be mindful of the impact that that can have on you as the listener and as the participant today. So please just do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself and manage your own responses to any content that may have some kind of impact on you. All right, over to you, Lynn and Allison.
Thanks, Claire, and welcome everyone. So I'm Lynn Radford, and along with my colleague Allison Cox, I'd just like to share with you some of our practice around inclusive and broad approaches to assessment. Working with infants, children and young people who've been impacted by trauma and neglect requires a particular approach to the assessment. And our therapeutic work, which includes obviously assessment and intervention, is both broad in its reach and inclusive in who we seek to engage or partner with to assess the child's needs and to meet those needs. Our assessment is intentional and it's planned, and we have a focus on safety. We like to utilise a broad range of methodologies, including observations, interviews, psychometric and projective tests. So thinking about the child, the system or the network that surrounds the child's always important. We heard earlier today about Bronfenbrenner's ecological map. But for the kids in the out-of-home care system, the kids that we work with, it's particularly important because they've had parents that haven't been able to provide the child with the care that they need. So many of you will be part of a system around an infant or a child or a young person who's experienced this kind of trauma or neglect. And that might be because you work in the out-of-home care sector, or in education or disability services or mental health or family services. You'll be really crucial members to their care team or their network. So what we want to do is we wanted to help illustrate our assessment approach. We want to use a case study. And in this case study, we'll have a particular focus on one element of the assessment so that we can demonstrate the complexity of the work. The case isn't a real case, as Claire was talking about. It's an amalgam of many cases, but it's somewhat typical of the cases that we work with. This is not a picture of a Take Two client. So I want to talk to you about Taylor. Taylor was 8 years old when he was referred to Take Two. He was in a kinship placement with the aunt of his half-siblings, and his half-siblings were also living there. Things weren't going so well for Taylor in his placement, and that was because he had some really challenging behaviours. And the carer was finding it really, really hard to look after him, and she often expressed these feelings overtly to Taylor, and she'd call him bad. She'd tell him that if he didn't behave, he'd have to live somewhere else. So that was pretty awful for Child Protection to hear that this was going on, and they were really worried about the impact of this on Taylor, but they were really keen to keep him with his siblings. So it was quite a conundrum for them. And there wasn't really another care option for the sibling group. And interestingly, the carer was actually doing quite a good job with the other children. And so they felt really hopeful that perhaps she could do the same for Taylor. So with this in mind, Child Protection asked Take Two if we could complete an assessment with the aim of stabilising the placement and supporting the carer. So we have some information at the start from the referral, and so we had some idea about the kinds of behaviours that the carer had identified as her finding most challenging. And these were Taylor's really aggressive outbursts, and these included hitting and scratching other people. He was extremely fussy about food. He lacked empathy in her mind. He really wasn't able to share with his siblings or with his peers, and he needed to be in control all the time. And the school was having similar problems with him at school, similar kind of behavioural problems. Some of the positive things that we knew about Taylor were that he was really academically very capable. He was very neat and tidy and liked to keep his room and his schoolwork organised. He enjoyed playing games, but he struggled when he had to go out in a game. And he really, really enjoyed playing with his Matchbox cars, and that could keep him occupied, and he'd play quietly for hours. We knew some things about his family and his developmental history. So we knew that his parents had their own histories of trauma and disrupted attachments, and they'd both actually been in the out-of-home care sector themselves when they were children and young people. Both of his parents had a history of substance misuse and mental health problems. And Taylor had lived with his parents for the first 8 months of his life. And he was actually removed when his mother was hospitalised. And she was hospitalised because she was really severely beaten by a man who actually wasn't Taylor's father. So that kind of gave us an indication as to what life might have been like in those first 8 months of Taylor's life. Once he moved out of mum's care, he actually moved quite a few times over the next 2.5 years. And then he finally came to his current placement when he was about 3 years old. So the next thing that we wanted to think about were what do we know about his current relationships, because that's really important. So we knew that he was living with his 2 half-siblings and their aunt. We knew he had older half-siblings that lived in Perth, and they were on his father's side, but he'd never met them or had any contact with them. His father had died when Taylor was 5, and that was after an assault in the community. Taylor hadn't had any contact with his mother since he was about 6. So in undertaking an assessment, there were, just from the information that we already had, we were able to start to hypothesize. And then that really drove our assessment planning, because the assessment would be about testing those hypotheses. So some of our hypotheses, well, the main hypotheses were the question around, were the behaviours adaptive responses to the trauma experiences? Were the behaviours a symptom of trauma re-experiencing or avoidance? Was there a neurobiological basis for the behaviours? Like, was it ASD, ADHD? Or were the behaviours a reflection of earlier brain development in the context of trauma and neglect in those early years of brain development? So what we want to do now is we just want to do a quick poll, and Jessamy going to pop that up for us. The poll is anonymous. The link is in the chat. So if you wouldn't mind just taking the next 30 seconds to answer this poll, we'll come back and have a look at the results. So good, I can see that people are answering them. Can other people see what's on the screen? Claire, I can see, yep, thank you. Wasn't sure if it was just me that could see that or not. So, yeah, that's great. Yeah, we've got about half the people have answered. So even without everyone finishing, I think that it's pretty clear that people are questioning the responses to trauma. And good question. He's obviously experienced trauma and neglect. And I think that this kind of spread, it just really shows that this is fairly typical of the kids that we work with, that people are making lots of guesses about what might be going on, and any one of them might actually be the answer that we're looking for. And that's why we're doing the assessment, to see if we can kind of test those hypotheses. I'm going to hand over to Allison now, who's going to go with the next slide.
I, of course, did the thing that everyone has to do in a session, is start to speak without unmuting. So hi, everyone. And thanks, Claire and Lynn, for getting us started this afternoon. And welcome everyone to the presentation. As Lynn's talked about, and people have shared already with their different thoughts about what might be going on for this young person, there can be, the young people that we often work with here at Take Two often present with very confusing presentations. They often have really confusing histories, and it can be really tricky sometimes to sort out what's what. As we've got there in our question, is it autism that's looking maybe like trauma, or is it trauma looking maybe like autism? And often people will ask us, so which bit of what they're doing is autism and which bit of what they're doing is trauma? And I think what people are sharing when they ask that question is how confusing it is, and how hard it is to know where to get started and how to understand what might be going on for the young people that we work with. We know that children and young people who have experienced developmental or complex trauma within their families of origin frequently show responses and actions that can resemble the presentations of children with autism spectrum disorders, or ASD. These might include things such as a child or young person tuning out to their surroundings, having a strong desire for routines, being fearful of change, having meltdowns, and sometimes difficulties getting along with others, whether that's people their own age or adults. And thus it can be really difficult to work out if a child's presentation is as a result of ASD or trauma. And of course, further compounded by the occasions in which children actually have both going on. So they might have an autism spectrum disorder, but also have experienced childhood trauma, with each of them contributing to the child or young person's presentation and their experience. So where do we start? So many of the children, as I said, in our program do have these sorts of things going on for them. And our approach is generally informed by an understanding that many of the pain-based behaviours observed in the children who have experienced trauma can resemble children with neurodevelopmental disorders. So we go into our engagement and work with children having in mind already multiple hypotheses about what might be going on. So it might not be one or the other, it might actually be both. Our approach to determining what might be happening and what factors might be contributing to their presentation has a few really key elements. So that initially getting to know the child, what are their strengths, their likes, their dislikes? Who are they behind the behaviours that people keep describing and find challenging? We know that all of us are much more than labels that get put on us or the behaviours that people might see. What has happened for this young person in their past and how have they come to understand that? How do they experience their present? And what are their thoughts about the future, their hopes, their dreams? We try wherever we can to observe the child or young person in multiple settings. So it might be home, might be school, might be with different people. So their peers, might be with carers, with biological parents, with school staff. And that way we get to observe how the child manages in different environments with different stimuli, how they manage relationships with different people, both relationships that are more familiar and relationships that are less familiar, and to observe how they respond to structured and unstructured environments, as well as routines and changes to routines. So when the routines are nice and stable, and when, as we know in school environments, routines often have to change despite best intentions. We also want to hear from people who know the child. So parents, carers, teachers, about their observations and experiences. This may include also standardised assessment measures we might use on occasions where we think that they might add additional information. It might also involve us talking to other professionals, speech pathology, OTs, paediatricians, child psychiatrists, either as consultations or for further information, or if they've been involved as well. That might happen as part of an assessment process, or it might be a recommendation that follows an assessment. Sometimes it's not actually possible, unfortunately, to work out exactly what the reason is for a child's presentation, or it might take time to complete further assessments or to trial interventions. And through that, it might actually become a bit more clear. The good news is that because there are similarities sometimes between the intervention approaches for children with ASD and for those with developmental trauma experiences, it is possible to get started with some strategies without a diagnosis in some circumstances. Frequently, the strategies that will assist a child experiencing an autism spectrum disorders will also work for the child who has experienced significant trauma and is displaying these pain-based behaviours. This would include a focus on achieving safety. In a school environment, this might mean establishing a signal a child can use to communicate feeling unsafe or overwhelmed, a safe place a child can retreat to when they are feeling overwhelmed, or activities that the child experiences as calming. Routines and predictability are calming for most people, and involving children and young people as to the things that they find calming will be the most useful. This will all help to increase a sense of safety, and we know for all of us that when we feel safe, we all perform better. Lynn will talk a bit more in detail now regarding the assessment with Taylor and how she looked at some of these different factors, in particular, the engagement with Taylor's carers.
Thanks, Alison. So you'll see from this word slide, this word cloud, that we've reflected some of the things that that Alison talked about. So for us to gather the information that we need to test our hypotheses, we really need a multifaceted approach, and it's really complex. And you can see that, I think, from all of these words on this word cloud. But particular challenges that we face in Take Two with our client group is that we're often dealing with fragmented information about developmental history. And we might not ever fill those gaps. And it's hard not knowing, hard for us and hard for the kids. Developing a trusting relationship with the clients and the carers and the parents can be really, really hard because many of these people have been traumatized within trusted relationships throughout their lives. And so trust for them is very, very difficult. Confidentiality often has more limits because child protection are involved. And so we need to be clear from the outset with the people that we're working with that the limits to our confidentiality are different to what they might experience in other places. Office-based appointments are often impossible. And so we really rely on our capacity to provide outreach and to meet the clients and carers and parents where they're at if it's safe for us to do so. It's a really complex care system around the child. It's often made up of professionals, and professionals have other lives that don't include the child, and they leave because they find another job, or they move interstate, they have children, all sorts of reasons. And so that means it's this kind of inconsistency around the child in the care team, in the network. And often what ends up happening is that there's no one that holds the child's history. And that's really challenging too. We're also working in a very stressed system, and relationships within the care network can be a bit fractured. And so it's really important that we develop good relationships with all the care team members within that system. I'm just going to get Allison to talk a little bit more about when the child is presenting with a really complex history.
Thanks, Lynn. So as we've already talked about, lots of the kids that we encounter and work with do present with really complex histories. And as we've already said, it can be hard sorting out what's what. And for particularly when we first meet a family or first hear the history, it can feel really overwhelming and really hard to know where to begin. Do you begin with child protection who are particularly concerned about safety in the care environment? Do you start with the teachers who are feeling really overwhelmed and not knowing how they can keep the child in the classroom and help them learn? Do you start with the foster carers? Do you start with the biological family? So absolutely appreciate how hard it can be to know where to begin. Usually where we start is with the child or young person. Obviously that depends a little bit on their age, but our intention would be from the very beginning to try and pay attention to helping, in particular, the child and the young person to feel safe in engaging with us. So that might mean we take things slowly to begin with and hear from them first as to what are the things that most concern them. And then maybe again, depending on where the biggest problems are or the biggest challenges are, that might be where we go to next in terms of gaining some information and again, building a sense of safety, not only for the child and family, but for all of the professionals currently involved who are wanting some help. Then we probably would try and address some of the issues that might come up in that initial referral or in the assessment information. So in this particular scenario, it might be, as we've already touched on, is this young person experiencing mental health difficulties, or is it trauma, or is it developmental difficulties? And again, as I've already said, we would go into that thinking that in fact it might not be one or the other, it might be all of it. And that we would start to try and observe the child and try to make sense of what we see. We know that the children that we work with have, as Sandra spoke about this morning, usually have experienced traumatic experiences in their lives. That's why they've come to our attention. But this doesn't always translate directly into children and young people experiencing mental health difficulties. We know that strong positive relationships can mitigate the effect of traumatic events. And we see this most often following single event traumas in the community. However, for the children that we work with, unfortunately, the experience of trauma that they have witnessed or experienced directly often occurs in the absence of such supportive adults, or the adults themselves may have experienced significant trauma in their own childhoods or alongside the child and young person, as we often see in family violence. So we, as we already talked about, we would begin with data gathering, essentially. So talking to people, talking to the child, talking with the other professionals, trying to understand the different lenses and perspectives that people bring to their thinking about Taylor. One of the challenges is sometimes, or if we've touched on where to begin, and the other dilemma can be when to stop doing assessment. Sometimes it can be hard to know when enough is enough. And I know within our program, we struggle with that sometimes as well, because we might not still yet understand quite what's what. We might not know if it's autism or trauma or a mental health problem. But as I said, sometimes it's all three. usually what we do is have a time point that we say, okay, let's go with the information we've got at the moment. We know that we won't truly understand the young person's experience themselves, only they can do that. But we may have enough to go with to be able to have a working hypothesis that resonates for the child, the family, and those working with the young people. We'll continue to test out that hypothesis as more information comes to hand, and potentially gathering more supportive adults and additional professionals along the way. And we'll get started. And we would see assessment as an ongoing process, not necessarily something that ends at the end of a 4-week or a 6-week assessment process. We would develop a hypothesis and continue to test the hypothesis as we get further information. Okay, so as we've already indicated, unfortunately, sometimes for the children that we meet, there's often big gaps in the information that we have available, big gaps in children's history. There might not be anyone in the child or young person's life at the moment who knows things like when they first walked, or when they first talked, or what their first words were, or what the family situation was like when mum was pregnant with Taylor. And so we often have these big significant gaps in the information available about early development, about milestones, experiences of growing up, relationships with primary carers. And some family members and the children and young people themselves might not feel safe enough to share information as well about what was going on in some of those early times. We know it can be very shameful for some carers to talk about what might have been going on, and for children as well. So again, we need to continue to work to demonstrate that we're safe and protective adults, and that gradually over time, some of that information might become more visible and able to be shared. So it can be a challenge when some diagnoses require information about these very details, such as with autism spectrum disorders, for example. And the absence of this information poses challenges for professionals, but also provides insight into the experience of what the children might experience when they don't see photos from when they first walked, or stories of when they first did something. So if we're feeling a big gap and that it's really hard for us to move forward without that knowledge, I can only imagine what it's like for the children and the young people that we work with. So what we do is we try and find the people that can shed light on the experience of the younger child. And this might involve working quite hard to try and find the parents or the other people that were around in the early years of this child's life. There might be extended family members we can talk to, or earlier foster carers who might be able to provide some insight as to what this child was like as a baby or as a toddler, and start to bring some of that, some of those stories into the child's present. We usually will try and document some of that information and share it with the children as well as appropriate, so that we can start to fill in the gaps as well, not only in our knowledge, but for the child or young person. We often do have access to some information that other professionals don't. And one of those pieces of information is often the things that brought the child to the attention of child protection. So we often have quite a lot of information about some of the negative events or experiences that have occurred for the child. And this does enable us to be curious with the child as to what their understanding and perceptions were or are of these things that have occurred. Obviously, we do that gently and at a developmentally appropriate level. But it does give us an opportunity to explore with the child about how this might be impacting on their current relationships and way that they go about interacting with others. Sometimes our work is about trying to understand how the child makes sense of all of this and what's gone on, both what's occurred and what they don't know, and then to work with others to develop a narrative or a life story that the child can take with them as they move forward on their journey. But we're going to move now to where do we begin?
So where did we begin? As Allison mentioned, we have a child-centred approach. So we always begin with thinking about the child, but any work that we do directly with the child requires the establishing of safety. So where we actually begin is different in every case, and sometimes there are practical or logistical considerations that inform our decision about where we begin. But regardless of these circumstances, as well as being child-centred, we also need to start with informed consent, and we need that from the child's guardian. So in this case, because of the order that the child was on, child protection was the guardian, and so that was fairly easy for us to get informed consent from the practice leader at child protection. And after we did that, we actually started with the carer, and I'm going to focus on that now. So why did we start with the carer? There were a number of reasons, and there's a number of reasons, I think, to highlight why we would start there, but particularly around the issue of providing some safety for the child. Lisa, you might have your you might need to mute yourself. Thank you. So yes, particularly to provide some safety for the child, we needed to do something with the carer. She was really crucial to not only the safety at the beginning, but also the outcome of what we were trying to achieve. And an interview with her sort of posed some particular challenges that would be really good for us to think about here. So it was really clear from the point of referral that the carer was really having trouble liking Taylor. And you could kind of, if you looked at it from her point of view, you could kind of see why it was hard for her. He wasn't biologically related to her. His siblings were, but he wasn't. His aggressive outbursts sometimes resulted in her or his siblings being harmed, and that was hard. His food preferences were quite rigid, and they created quite a bit of work for her, and often resulted in him having a meltdown when she didn't get things quite right, and that was pretty stressful. And it was hard for her to feel empathy for him when she experienced him as completely lacking empathy for anyone. So building a positive and trusting relationship with her was really key to us understanding how to stabilise a placement and how to support her to see Taylor in a different way, like helping her, how could we help her to find a way to like him, to like some things about him, and to like him maybe at least some of the time, and that way be able to connect with him. So on top of that, she'd also had some previous experiences with services, and that had really kind of impacted on her ability to trust services, because she'd felt really condescended, and she'd felt blamed and a little bit stupid. And so we had to be really careful thinking about that and how to build trust and within that kind of setting. So the way we did that was by meeting her with where she was at. So physically and also emotionally, to think about what her needs were. And we did that by giving her some control over where and when the sessions were. Helping her to understand the assessment process and take two's role in that assessment process. Ensuring that she felt that her own experience was heard and acknowledged and really, really listened to, not just paid lip service to. We needed to be transparent about the limits of confidentiality with the child protection involvement and the limits to the information that we might be able to provide back to her. We needed to provide some support for her within the care team meeting. She was the only person in that care team that wasn't a professional. And it was really challenging for her to sit in that environment and her expertise not be acknowledged. And she had expertise. She was the one who knew him best. And that really needed to, the rest of the care team really needed to understand that. We needed to give her feedback and suggestions about how Taylor's behaviour and about Taylor's behaviour and what responses might be helpful. We needed to do that throughout the assessment, not just waiting till the end. And we needed to include her in the hypothesising. So we had a really collaborative approach with her and thought together about what was going on. And also needed from the outset to establish her goals for both the assessment and the intervention, and really ensure that we were aligned, that her goals were aligned with ours. So yes, that's where we began in this case.
Lynn, I was wondering, I mean, all of that sounds like a lot of work.
Yes.
And I know important, but did that take a lot of time when you were doing this work with Taylor?
The thinking takes time, and we really needed to prioritize that. So as has been talked about previously, we're very lucky in Take Two that we really value supervision and the reflective space that we have in supervision. So even just thinking about the importance of the carer and what her needs might be, how to establish a trusted relationship, all of that took some unpacking before we even met anyone, just when we had the referral. But the actual, yes, it does take some time, but it doesn't take as long as you think it's going to. And it's that kind of the effort that you put in early on, you really get the dividends later on, and it's really worthwhile.
Is there a particular approach that you take to that carer engagement, do you think?
I think that using Dan Hughes' PACE approach is really helpful, and the P in PACE, the playful, you don't always use that, and that would come into its own, I think, when the child's involved, but really absolutely being accepting of her, of where she is, what her experiences have been and were, what she wanted, what her desires were, being curious about those things, and having empathy. Really valuable way to approach actually all of our relationships, to be honest, because it's how you make the most out of collaborative relationships. And I just think that being very attuned and really listening and hearing what she had to say was key.
And Lynn, one of the questions that comes to my mind, and so I imagine it might be to some of the audience, is, was she, given that at times she didn't find Taylor very likable and a bit challenging within her family, was she able to find some things that were likable about him?
Yeah, and it was interesting because she actually, she also had a lot of guilt about not liking him. So we had to kind of get her to a point where she could admit that that there were at least things that she didn't like, because she started off in a very defensive position. So once we got her to sort of say, well, you know, I actually don't like him a lot of the time, we then were able to sit down and think, well, when do you like him? And shift her away from that kind of guilty position and acknowledge that actually it's hard to, in her position, it was hard to like Taylor. But the key to it was actually finding some kind of similarities with the siblings, who she actually was very fond of, but also some differences, and some things about the two of them and how they got along and what they shared. And as we discovered those together, she then took that into her relationship with Taylor, and it had that really positive snowball effect that she noticed those really nice interactions that she had with him, and she sought more of them, and then he enjoyed them and he gave her positive feedback, and that kind of went from there. And then when we had the dyad in the room together, we could really explore that and how lovely it was. So yes.
So an example, and I know there was lots of different work that happened with Taylor, but an example of where intervening at the level of the carer had a big impact on how Taylor was feeling and presenting.
Yes, and had a big impact from the beginning. So we didn't have to wait till we'd had an assessment, completed an assessment, given feedback and commenced an intervention. Things were beginning to get better before we even completed our assessment. And that really gave us hope for any intervention, because we could see that the carer wanted what we wanted. She wanted to provide him with a good home, and she just needed someone to kind of acknowledge and hear where she was at, and to help her to have some strategies about how to manage his really difficult behaviours. And that doesn't mean it was easy and it was all plain sailing, but she had a different mindset.
And an example of hypothesis testing, really.
Yes.
Testing a hypothesis that maybe if it was possible for the carer to think differently about Taylor, and therefore to interact differently, that maybe some of his behaviours might shift.
Absolutely. So both testing the hypothesis about his behaviours and also testing the hypothesis about the placement in a way. If she couldn't change, then actually him not being with his siblings would be better if he was in a care placement where his needs were actually being met. So there's a lot that's going on in that assessment.
Yeah. So we might move on to some of our practice considerations. And we've already touched on some of those just through that little chat we had just then, but just to come back and summarise some of them a little bit. So one of the first ones that we're wanting to share and kind of summarise a little bit toward the end of this presentation is about the importance of sharing the dilemmas. So we don't know everything. In fact, sometimes we feel like we don't know much at all. Maybe like some of the people in the room today. But if we share the dilemma about what might be going on for this young fellow or for any of the other children and young people that we work with, and we reach out to hear other people's perspectives and put all of those perspectives together, we can reach ideally a shared understanding and an approach in which we're all working together and pulling together to have an understanding about what might be contributing to this young person's presentation. So I think Lynn illustrated that for Taylor, there were some things that had gone on in his childhood that was contributing to his presentation, but also was his current circumstances were also significantly contributing, with him not feeling so safe or secure within those relationships. And then he probably had got himself into a bit of a cycle where he felt a bit scared. And so then he displayed behaviours that pushed him away even further from people and therefore increased his anxiety. And then his behaviours got worse and in a really negative cycle. Whereas Lynn, engaging with Taylor's carer, was able to help the carer have a different perspective and take on board a different lens as to what might be happening for Taylor. And with that, we got a shift and a shared hypothesis about contributing factors. So we see that as one of the really key learnings that we bring to our work. Another one is that many children and people experience a range of developmental, relational and adverse experiences. As we know, we're much more than our parts. When we bring it all together, it becomes a complex whole. And that's no less so for the children that we work with. And sometimes it's really hard to know what's causing what. Is it the autism? Is it the trauma? What's at the beginning? What's at the end? And sometimes it might not matter. Sometimes what might matter is getting started with addressing the things that are contributing to this child or young person feeling less secure than we'd like them to be, or that ultimately they would like to be. We know that the more safe and secure children feel, as for all of us, the better the outcomes will be. And that's the absolutely best place to begin. And we saw that Lynn did that with Taylor in terms of beginning with the carer, because she was the crucial person in order to create safety within this placement for this young fellow. And so in terms of some other things that we bring to our perspective would be that we need to have an understanding of the functional nature of the behaviour and about what the experience of those around a young person is, and what their life experiences have been, and as I already said, their current experience. But I imagine there might be some questions in the chat.
Yeah,
Claire?
sorry, Alison, I'm jumping in because Claire unfortunately has had some connection issues. But we do have a question, and this might be one for you, Lynn, just about PACE, Dan Hughes' model of PACE. I suppose not everyone in the audience would be familiar with that today. If you could maybe speak to that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jessamy. Dan Hughes, you'll find him on YouTube, and he has a wonderful way of explaining this. So he'll do a better job than me, but in a nutshell, PACE is an acronym, so PACE, and it is really an approach that we have to relationships with children, with carers, and in fact all relationships, because it's the way you'll get the best out of those relationships. So the acronym stands for playful, accepting, curious, and empathic. And the playful component isn't in every interaction, but the other three are. So we approach all of our relationships with acceptance. We accept the person for who they are. We are curious about their experiences and their emotions, and we have empathy for them. But the playfulness can be really lovely with kids, to help us kind of achieve what we achieve. And it's one of those things, actually, it's really helpful for people that are in the care network of the child to apply that approach to their interactions with the children. So I really would encourage you to have a look at Dan Hughes, because he really does do a lovely job of explaining it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lynn. And I guess another question is around if you could maybe provide a bit of a summary around the clinical measures that are used in Take Two, but also maybe a bit of an overview for those that haven't used clinical measures about, you know, how they work and what they're for.
Yeah, sure. So we have a range of clinical measures, and that we utilise, and it depends on the age of the child. So for infants and younger children, we use the Ages and Stages questionnaire, and there's a social emotional version of that as well. We use the HANOSCA for children that are 3 and up, which is a mental health tool that is scored by the clinician. We use the Adaptive Behaviour Assessment Scale, the ABAS, and that's a really helpful tool to help us. It's a psychometric test that is normed, and it's about a child's development and their functioning. So it really helps us to know where the gaps are, where the skills are, what we need to address. And we use the trauma symptom checklist, and there's 2 versions of that. There's one for young children and one for older children. And so the older children one is a self-assessment, and the younger one is ones where the carers do the assessing. They're probably our core ones. And then we are very lucky to have the NMT, the neurosequential metric therapeutics, which is not an assessment tool, but it's more a case conceptualisation tool. So the information that we have, we can feed into that, and that really helps us to understand about where the child's at, again, functioning, and to have a kind of picture of their brain development, which is really helpful to share with the carers and the care network of the child. Allison, did you have more? Did I miss anything?
I think that gives a really good overview, Lynn, and we're fortunate in the program to have a couple of specialist staff as well. So we have a neuropsychologist, an occupational therapist, a speech pathologist, and a paediatric, senior paediatric fellow, and they also have additional measures at their disposal to tease out more nuanced elements of children's development as well. And then I think, Lynn, the process is then to kind of put all that information together, a bit like what you talked about in terms of the case conceptualization tool that we utilise, and see how we can bring together what we've observed and what we've heard, as well as what we've measured about a young person, and how we make sense of that all together.
Absolutely. I think what the professional term would be triangulation, but wanting to get information from a number of different sources, from our own observations of the child, from the understanding and the observations of other people that know the child well, those psychometric objective measures, and then individual sessions with the child where we use play to kind of get to some and some projective techniques to try to get a bit of an understanding about the child's inner world. And we bring all of that together to, again, test the hypotheses. Are we seeing what we think we're seeing? And does all of the information agree with that? And how do we understand what we're getting?
Wonderful. Thank you, Lynn and Allison. And there's such a good question in the chat. I'm actually just going to read it out verbatim. There has been some sort of back and forwards in the chat about this particular question, but it'll be really interesting to hear your perspective. So how do you meet or curb carers' expectations when carer burnout is being experienced and are just wanting for their child to be fixed?
That is such a fantastic question, audience members, and such a common question. I think for all of us, it's really confronting when we hear what the children that we work with have been through and what they might be currently experiencing. And I think for all of us, we come into this work to make the lives of children and young people better. So we would often think about together what's going on when we have an even stronger urge than usual to do what we often see as rescuing children, and to try and make everything all better and wrap it up in a nice little box with a nice little neat bow. What we would do is to try and think together about what it is exactly that they're wanting fixed, and what is it that's going on for the adults who want things to be fixed, and what do they think will be better or different when it is fixed. So I think we would, which I know is incredibly frustrating for people on the receiving end, but we would probably approach such a question with some more questions, and apply the curiosity that Lynn mentioned before to explore that a bit further. We know that for all of us, we are a sum of our experiences. So it's not necessarily possible to easily fix what is the result of our experiences. We're all complex human beings, as are the kids that we've worked with. And usually they've developed a range of strategies to cope. They might have been adaptive to begin with. They might have a strong flight or fight response that's kept them safe. And that same strong coping mechanism may not be so useful now, but I think we have to be careful of thinking or sending a message to the child that somehow they're bad or they're wrong, or that coping strategy, we have to take it away now, because that coping strategy, which we may find unpleasant or unhelpful, might actually have served this young person really well. It may have meant that they found a safe place to hide when things were kicking off at home. It might be that they ran to their neighbour's house because that was a place of safety when home wasn't safe. It could be that they found a way to find food in other children's lunchboxes at school because they didn't get any food at home. We might see that as stealing and a negative behaviour, but on the other hand, it might be meeting a very basic need for that child. So I think we would bring to it curiosity, we would try and reflect, and we would think together about what might be the reason or the meaning behind the behaviour that the child's presenting with, or that the carer is finding particularly difficult. In terms of expectations, I think we do need to help people realise that we're playing a long game here. The children that we work with have been, if they've come to the attention of child protection and they've moved into the out-of-home care system, we know that they have experienced a very, very significant level of abuse, neglect, and or family violence. That's not going to be fixed overnight, and that this child will carry the scars of that into their adult life. And I think it is important that the people around a young person do understand that there are no quick fixes, and that the damage for some of the kids that we work with is so significant that unfortunately they will experience lifelong implications of that. And then it's the hope that we need to bring in, is that we can get started on trying to address what we can while we're working together, and maybe make that journey easier for the young person. Lynn, was there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, look, I think great question, because everyone always wants a child fixed. It's not just burnt out carers. And a really good answer, Alison. The only thing that I would add is that I think my experience with carers that have been burnt out is often, these are people who have decided to give of themselves and of their lives to these kids. And sometimes, no matter how much they give and how many things that they do and how many suggestions they take up, they don't get the results that they don't want. They don't get the feedback that they want. The child remains with really tricky behaviours. And what I've found really helpful in these situations is to reflect with the carer that the child's behaviours aren't a reflection of the care that they've received, because it's often been really, really great care, but they're a reflection of the experiences that they've had when they were younger. So the child is showing them what they've experienced, and that can hit the mark sometimes when carers can stop blaming themselves, because often there's a lot of guilt there about not doing a good enough job, not being good enough to make things better, and then the problem must be located in the child, so let's fix the child. So yeah.
Thank you. And there's another great question here. It's a very practical question from Elizabeth. There are lots of educators here today. What role could you see us taking in the role of assessment? But I think we could also think about that question more broadly as to, other disciplines, other professionals that might be here today. How is it that people can play a role in the assessment process?
Yeah, so I'm happy to go first, Lynn, and you can back me up. So educators are crucial to our work. You play such a pivotal and important role in the lives of children and young people. I know your task is to educate, but my experience is educators do so much more than just educate, and it's such a complex role with so many nuances. Sometimes for the children that we work with, you are the key adult in their life, that's predictable, that's there each day, that treats them with respect and is a safe adult. So you're crucial in helping us to understand about how the child presents to you in that environment, how their presentation kind of compares across all of the children that you've worked with over the years. So kind of giving an insight into the kind of average child that is in your care and how this child compares. Your experience of what you've tried and what's worked and maybe what hasn't worked quite as well as you'd hoped. Your observations about what goes on in the schoolyard, what goes on in the classroom. So yeah, certainly to partner with us, I think, in that assessment process. We really value your expertise and what you've observed and know about a child like Taylor.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with that, Alison. Aside from the carers or the parents, the educators are the people that know the children best. And so we absolutely need their information about what they see, what they think. As you said, they have a much better sense of children of that age and what they, kind of more normal presentations. And also to partner with them in terms of thinking about how to get better results and to sort of try out some different things, because often they're a more regulated adult in the child's life, so already have good structure and routine, but also kind of know how to manage themselves, particularly if it's parents that are caring for the child and they haven't had good experiences of being parented themselves.
Wonderful, thank you. Look, I think we've maybe got just 2 minutes left for one really quick question. I guess what happens when there's a difference of opinion between professionals about maybe what's going on for the child and what might be the best approach to working with the child?
Yep, another great question, Jasmine, and I think one that can happen all the time. I think again, what we would bring to that is curiosity again. So trying to understand what the lens is that particular professional is bringing to their view, sharing our view and seeing if we can either get to a position of a shared view, or maybe that we'll follow one lead and see how that goes and then follow the other. So that hopefully we get to agreement, or there may be an agree to disagree, but still work together, is how I would approach that. Not sure if you've got anything to add, Lynn, in the last.
I think,
30
again,
seconds.
if it's a disagreement with us, again, it's applying a PACE approach to the relationship with the person and really trying to understand what it is. So that, because as we've said, collaboration is key. So we need to find a way to work together.
And also, as we've already, we're not necessarily right either. So there's different perspectives and they're all valuable.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you very much. That brings us up to 2 p.m. on the nose, which is the end of the session. Thank you very much, Lynn and Allison. That was really interesting. We had some lovely chats happening. And unfortunately, we didn't get around to all of the questions. So my apologies to those of you that we didn't get to respond to. But at this point, we will be having a half-an-hour break. And we do have one more session today from 2:30 till 3:30, intervening to address both mental health and trauma. So you're welcome to come back to that session, and we will be ending this meeting, so please log back on closer to 2:30. We hope to see you then.
Thanks, everyone.